Right, we are live. Part two.
G'day. All
Hey,
right. So for those listening and joining us again for this video or podcast, I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. Welcome to another episode of A Lutheran Conversation, podcast produced by the Order of Knight George, an Australian-based Lutheran media ministry. Find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, MeWe, Rumble, Facebook, or our website, www.knightgeorge.info. And again, since we're on YouTube, I'm going to take the chance to advertise for our Order of Knight George merchandise. You can find on Spreadshirt. Just look up the Order of Knight George, and you'll be able to find hats, cups, shirts, jumpers, aprons with the Order of Knight George logo and other pictures printed on them. So we're joined again with Matthew Garnett for another episode. This will be episode 21 for those who are listening on the Order of Knight George, either podcast or YouTube channel. So it'll be episode 21. But for those who are watching on Matthew's, in layman's term, YouTube channel, you're going to get it probably a couple months in advance, because at the time of recording, I've only just released episode 12 of A Lutheran Conversation on the Order of Knight George, and I've got episode 13 hopefully coming out this week. But as of now, episode 21 that we're recording on Matthew's channel, so he's going to play it live. And basically, this is a special episode. Normally the show is where I do interviews about people's faith and journey and their views on Lutheranism, but I also can just do shows talking about whatever I want to talk about. It's my podcast, so I'll do what I want. And today we've got Matthew to join me to discuss the topic of Christianity and communism. And what is the relationship? Is there a relationship? Does Christianity coincide with communism? Can you be a Christian and a communist? All these topics we're going to try and tackle in about the next half hour. Since I'm leading the show, I might just give some of my first initial thoughts on communism, and then I'll let Matthew jump in with his thoughts. Essentially, when it comes to economic systems, there tends to be the two different competing sides of communism and capitalism. And both of them seem to have their advantages, and both of them seem to have some disadvantages to them. Communism sounds nice because it's all about sharing and everybody gets an equal share. But then when you actually try to apply this in a state setting, it becomes problematic, where the government just takes money from the worker to give it to the people who, well, if they were given to people who couldn't work, like just elderly people or sick people, that's one thing. But then they go and give it to also to people that don't want to work, which is often the side effect of communism, because if you can get money for free and just don't do anything, well, why wouldn't you take it? Whereas capitalism, on the other side, if you follow it to its logical conclusions, it's all about profit margins and self-interest, and it doesn't really care much about the neighbor. I think ultimately one of the key features that you need in either of those systems is Christianity. If you try to have either of those worldviews without Christianity, there is quite a lot of problems. You can see this in the USSR and communist China and those communist countries where they have a communism built on atheism, and you see how much death and destruction and just absolute chaos is in those countries. Where, however, now if you look at the Christian, if you look at capitalism in the West without Christian values now, it's quite problematic, where it becomes very profit-driven, very self-motivated. And I was just thinking about this before in lead up to the episode. I thought one of the biggest problems with capitalism is that you hear people say profit drives incentive. Now, that can be good, because this is why you hear people talk, this is what leads us out of poverty. If I have profit and I can make money, well, then of course I'm going to work hard because I'm going to get something back out of it. The problem is when you don't have a Christian value underlying that, you tend to get now these days where you get it's just for the profit and the quality goes out the window. You think about back in the 70s and those period where people would build like a refrigerator or a car that lasts like 50 years and wouldn't break. Whereas you think now we get like iPhones and fridges that you have to replace like every 2 years, or you think of something like McDonald's where the burgers are getting smaller, but the price of the burger is going up. And that's because without a Christian value underlying capitalism, the capitalists are just wanting to make money. And if they can make shortcuts and give you an inferior product but still make more money, of course they're going to do that because they don't care about you, they care about themselves. What you really need is a Christian value, particularly I think in Lutheranism. When you look at Luther's catechism, he's got this idea of thou shalt not steal isn't just not stealing from your neighbor, but actually wanting to help your neighbor benefit in their property. And so when you have a Christian worldview, when you are a retailer and you're a capitalist and you're trying to make something and sell something, you're also wanting to sell a good quality product. You're wanting your customers to get the best they can get. You're trying to actually make a sale because you want your customer to have something. You don't just want to make money for the sake of making money. Whether it's capitalism or communism, both of them really need that Christian value system underneath. Otherwise, either system is going to lead to a bunch of sin. Because I mean, you can have somewhat of a Christian communism. I don't know if we can go too much on a large scale. I mean, you look at people always like to use the example of like the Acts 5 church where they all had everything in common, and that kind of works well when it's like a little community of like maybe 100 people living together. I mean, I've heard people say in a family we're all communists because generally you share and look after each other within your family. So when you're on a small scale, communism works. I think it becomes very problematic when you try to make it on a large scale. I think the other thing that gets thrown in here is the concept of a welfare state and government welfare, because I do think there is Christian principles for there to be welfare. However, the Christian principles has a lot of guidelines regarding how welfare should be dealt with. What I look at is in Ezekiel, God talks about the kings and what he calls the shepherds of Israel, and they had a responsibility to look after the poor, the homeless, the hungry, and actually provide for them. So there was somewhat of a concept where the king was to look after the widow, the orphan, the homeless, and all of those. So there is some sense of government welfare. However, as you see shown in Paul's letters, where Paul says things like, he who does not work should not eat. Therefore, if you're not willing to work, well, we're not just going to give you free money. I mean, if you're able to work, but you refuse to work, that doesn't qualify you for welfare. Welfare should be when you're unable to get something. Welfare should be seen as like a crutch you have to lean on, something that you use only as long as you need it, and then once your leg's healed, you can get back to running. You don't need it. Or in the case of the elderly and pensioners and stuff like that, well, they've kind of, that is, they should have done their work in their youth, and a lot of personal responsibility, where you get Paul in Timothy, where he has these guidelines about the church. This is the church's welfare rather than government welfare, but I think we can take those same principles and apply them, where Paul says, when it comes to giving this welfare to the widows, we need to ask a few questions. One, is she young? Like, is she some 20-year-old woman who her husband died in her 20s, that she's still quite young to go and marry another husband and have kids and grandkids? So if she's still young, then she should go and get remarried. She shouldn't just stay a widow for the rest of her life. And then again, all right, if she's an older widow, okay, does she have kids or grandkids that can actually provide for her? Because your family should provide for you first before you go looking for the state to provide. And then it's only after those things, Paul's like, okay, well, she's too old to get remarried. For whatever reason, she doesn't have any kids or grandkids that can provide for her. Then it's time for somebody else to step in and provide her with welfare. Only in those kind of circumstances. So, I live in Australia. We have government welfare. But I do think our government just tends to throw money at everything rather than we need to put more guidelines and restrictions on what kind of welfare we give. With all that said, those are my initial thoughts. I'll let Matthew give his thoughts and any comments he wants to make on what I've just said.
Right. Well, so yeah, that's why I wore this shirt today. If you all can see this, this is my Soviet propaganda poster shirt. And in Russian, it says, "Religion is poison, protect children." And underneath of that slogan, you can see the old woman trying to make the poor little girl, beautiful little girl dressed in the white and the red of the state, go to church. You see the church over here on this side, and on this side is the school, the state school where she's going to be educated properly. So it's a brilliant piece of propaganda, to show you how evil and old religion is, and we don't need that anymore. What we need is the new and the young education of the state. And so communism proper, especially when we talk about Marxism, Marx called religion the opiate of the masses. He believed religion was something that the capitalist or the bourgeois invented in order to keep the workers satiated, so they wouldn't cause too much trouble because the capitalists were too busy exploiting them for gain of money, and so the bourgeois could live a comfortable life, and the proletariat or the workers could work for the capitalists their whole life. That was Marx's theory. And in Soviet Russia, that's how they proceeded. Really, they had abolished. It was illegal, in fact. You hear all the stories of they were Eastern Orthodox there, and you hear all the stories of the Eastern Orthodox priests being thrown in the gulags, and so on and so forth. And we as Lutherans say what you will about the Catholic, the Romanists, the Papists, but John Paul was right to be anti-communist. He was right to do that because the communists wanted to abolish religion, and that's something that I'm not quite sure I've completely settled on, but I'm pretty close to saying that you can't, that if you're going to have a truly communist state, then if you're going to have religion at all, it's got to be highly controlled, like it is in China, where they've got a complete surveillance state there, where you can have a church, but they're going to be watching you the entire time. And if you start speaking against the party or getting out of line with what you would preach in church, they're going to have to correct that, because at the end of the day, the entity that has to be the highest authority in a communist society is the government, is the people. The people have to be the ultimate authority. And so I think you necessarily have to have an atheistic type of situation for communism to even work. Otherwise, there is so much that is involved, in my opinion, with communism that is anti-biblical, as you're pointing out, Pastor. And you as a pastor, you are one of your main roles as a pastor. Sometimes when the state is doing something unjust, you are called to, as Luther teaches us, we are called to hold the state to account, to biblical account. And that is a very, so now you've got this kind of this power struggle going on between the church and the state, and this. So Marx just said, just get rid of that. It's just going to be, it's not true anyway. It's a false thing, and it's just something the bourgeois came up to control us poor workers. So we just need to get rid of it anyway. So if you're really going to go full on communist or socialist, religion's going to cause you a major problem, because at the end of the day, what you want to look to as your provider and your authority is the people, or what they would say the state, which they would consider to be the people. Now, in theory, right, as most people would think, that idea of all of us sharing in common, like Mark said, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, right, is what he says in the manifesto. So, so that sounds great, right? That sounds kind of like that idea you brought up from Acts, where they're all sharing together. The only problem is that human beings, I believe, so I'm very much I like Thomas Aquinas on natural law. I'm very much a believer in natural law. And really, at the end of the day, I think what we've discovered as human beings, even as Christians, either through natural law or through the Bible, is that the natural state or the state of man is such that basically what you want is a system of government and a system of economics that is going to constrain man's sin. That's the idea. You're really not looking to do much more than that. And what we've discovered is that I'm convinced is that the best way to do that without killing a bunch of people en masse, which is, like you pointed out, is what, so you've got, we all think Hitler's like the worst ever. He doesn't, he's a walk in the park compared to these guys. So Hitler slaughtered 6 million Jews, we might say, and then but then you've got Stalin, who's slaughtered somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 million of his own people during his reign of terror and communism. I'm not sure the numbers on Lenin, but then you've got somebody like Mao Zedong in China. The numbers there are incalculable. They're not sure. It's somewhere between 40 and 80 million. And then people like Pol Pot, who I think he's between 10 and 15. So you've got upwards of over 100 million people slaughtered by these communist dictators. So what we've found through very hard experience.
Well, just on that, I was just going to say, like, I think you're talking about Hitler, because, like, yeah. I think Hitler's only, like, number 5 or maybe not even in the top 5 of mass murderers. I think it's Attila the Hun and Genghis. I think Genghis Khan is number 1, and then there's, like, Pol Pot, Attila the Hun, and Mao, and then Hitler, I think, is the order. And so, like, yeah, communism and the Mongolian hordes actually killed way more people than the Nazis killed.
Oh yeah, no question about it. Yeah.
And you think also that communism has spread to? You think that actually communism has spread to more countries than Nazism ever did? So, right. I mean, Nazis, yeah, they killed a lot of people. They also killed a lot of people kind of in that only Central Europe area, whereas communism has spread all the way from the USSR, China, South America, Central America, African countries, and and
so the problem, as it turns out, that the first commandment is fairly useful here, because as it turns out, when men take ultimate authority, then again, the idea of government and an economic system is to constrain the passions or the excesses of men. That's really what the role and purpose of government should be. And when you have a man who sits atop of that thing that's supposed to be constraining the passions of men, and that man is in fact a man who is constraining his passions, especially when he bows to no other authority but himself. So his passions are going to run amok. And that probably is the number one downfall of communism, and why every time it's been tried, you've got these millions and millions of people slaughtered, because you've got one man atop this, or a group of men at best, that have no constraint on what it is that they want to do. So the idea of so even I might push back with you a little bit on my family being communist, but I would say it's more of a benevolent dictatorship. My wife and I are in charge, and we try to be nice, and we will share with you. But at the end of the day, we do share alike. But even in that context, it is voluntary. So you have a situation where we discovered that men unconstrained are very dangerous, especially when given a bunch of power. We want governments to constrain the passions of men, and when you have an unconstrained man trying to constrain the passions of everybody else and form them according to kind of his image, what you end up having is a bunch of rebellious people. So people don't like to. So for instance, you probably are. Well, I've seen it. You guys are experiencing this definitely in Australia with how strict you guys are with the COVID thing. People are just
Yeah,
out and out
ridiculous.
rebellion. Yeah, they don't want to follow the rules. Well, I share that sentiment. Now I'm a little over here on the edge of being rebellious in that sense, but when somebody tells me what to do without proper authority or without good reason, I have a problem with that. And so, while yes, I want to, I think we should help widows and orphans and poor people. The government coming in and mandating that or trying to force you to do that, it has proved to be a very poor way. Now, do we have to force people to do that? Like you said, do we need a welfare state? Probably. Yeah, we probably do, because most people, if that passion of theirs to hoard all of their, you mentioned these greedy capitalists, and there are some, for sure, no question. When they're unconstrained, then they will do. The bottom line to them is the bottom line. Doesn't matter if they pollute a river, if everybody else starves, they don't care as long as their bottom line is fat. So you do have to have government come in, and constrain that thing. Now that
Well,
is a messy and
if I
imperfect.
could, I was just gonna,
Yeah,
I was just gonna say if I can jump in there.
sure.
I think some people have sometimes taught to refer to it as interventionism, where like the government has to intervene in things like the market and
Right.
things like that to keep things under control. And I think actually, as a Lutheran, if you read Luther's catechism, Luther pretty much is kind of an interventionist. And I think,
Sure.
I mean, you can see this in kind of Luther. He had a big idea of, this freedom. He was very pushing for liberty in the German states to separate from Rome and the Holy Roman Empire. But at the same time, he also was very much the government had a duty to things, and they had to, Luther cracked down on rebellions and revolts and stuff like that. That the princes had to get in there and slaughter all the peasants. The whole peasants' revolt, that kind of went a bit chaotic. But particularly what I wanted to look at was in Luther's large catechism. And Luther talks a lot about how the government should operate in the fourth commandment, because you shall honor your father and your mother. The government, in the Lutheran perspective at least, probably I would argue just Christianity in general, that government grows out of parent, so that you have a family with the parent, that then becomes a tribe with a chief, that then becomes a city state with the king, and then the nation state with the king, and then like an empire with an emperor, and or whatever. So the idea is that government stems from the office of parent. They should look after us like a parent looks after a child. But Luther does make a brief mention about government's role in the economy when he gets to the topic of the seventh commandment on you shall not steal, where he's talking about how, as I mentioned before, with capitalism and stuff, that we're not stealing for Luther, and I would argue again just the biblical Christian, is not so much just not taking from your neighbor, but actually trying to protect your neighbor's property and make sure that your neighbor actually gets a fair deal and the best stuff. So that, like Luther would say, like if you're a dodgy merchant and stuff like that, that's actually stealing, using fake weights, counterfeit money, all this stuff, selling inferior goods. Even the concept of, not just selling inferior goods, but maybe selling a good, but selling it at a ridiculously high price that you know that this thing is not worth $1 million. It's probably only worth like 100,000. So it's not really fair for you to charge someone $1 million for something and stuff like that. And so Luther does address this issue where he does say that the princes, as he always refers to them as, the government, they have a duty to step into the marketplace and make sure that there is fair trading going on, that there is quality control, that people aren't just, ripping off the peasants and the poor. And so, yeah, a bit more interventionist in the market is generally the Lutheran view. That was Luther's view in the Catechism, because he saw that as part of the you shall not steal, that the government that has a responsibility to make sure that, well, this merchant is not ripping off all his customers. So, yeah, I think this is why I started. You always hear people they talk about like free market capitalism or communism, and I go, I really don't think Christianity is one or the other. We really like to take a little bit of both. I don't know if you ever heard of this term called there's distributionism is one term for it, but I don't like using that term because whenever I hear that, it reminds me of redistributionism, which is what communism is. Right. The other term for this system is called, and I always struggle to get this right, Cooperativism. That's
Oh,
right.
okay.
It's
Sure.
sometimes known as Catholic economic theory.
Yeah.
It was proposed by different popes, and it's the idea of the economic model that Christians should follow. And it's kind of a little bit of a mix of, it's like that midway option between full free market capitalism and full blown government top down communism, a
Yeah.
bit of. And also, I think one thing about the cooperativism, and this is why I prefer to use that term, is it really works more on the personal responsibility, really going back to this idea of an honor based society where you do stuff out of a sense of duty and responsibility, that you're not just, you know, not like we're in communism where you're forced to do stuff because the government says so and they're going to crack down on you with their strict iron fist.
Mm.
Or whereas like we're talking about capitalism, which is your motivation is I want to get rich and make a lot of money, whereas the cooperativism really focused on this. The driver was really I have a sense of duty. Yes, I have a duty to make money. I've got to provide for myself. I've got to provide for my family. So there is an incentive structure for me to get out, work, make money. But then I've also got a duty to make sure that my neighbor is taken care of, that my neighbor gets good products, and that I'm also not driving my neighbor into poverty just so that I can be rich. I heard one person explain it to me once. He says, because he's really big on cooperativism, and he says, imagine like, in capitalism, you'll have like two coffee shops and they'll be competing against each other, trying to drive each other out of business. And you really want, in order for you to succeed, the other coffee shop has to close. It's in the cooperative model, both coffee shops basically they come to like a mutual agreement of, okay, well, we're both going to sell coffee, but maybe I'll sell like desserts and cakes, and maybe you sell like sandwiches and pies and stuff like that. And so rather than trying to compete against each other, we work together and like we'll take slightly different niche markets so that we can both work alongside each other and not drive each other out of business.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a lot of this cooperative model where
Mm.
it drives more from a sense of duty and care for neighbor, and probably works a lot more like that's some of the bonuses it does have of like capitalism, where it's the bottom up. It really focuses on the responsibility of the individual, but then it doesn't go so much to, because I think this is where we have to go, where communism, it destroys individualism. It just completely destroys individualism. Everyone just becomes this blob of the people, and you're controlled by the government. And it's just, whereas with capitalism, though, it kind of takes individualism to an extreme where it's selfish and it's everybody looks after themselves, cares about themselves, worries about themselves. Whereas with Christianity, we should focus on everyone's an individual, everyone's made in the image of God, everyone is a precious soul. But at the same time, as Christians, there's also this love your neighbor as yourself, that your concerns are actually less about your own good and actually about the good of those around you.
Right.
So
That's
there
that's
should
interesting.
be individual responsibility.
Yeah. Well, and so yeah, the cooperativism idea might be somewhere between here and there. But one thing Adam Smith really talked about, I mean, if you read Wealth of Nations and you get capitalism out of that, and it's really in his second volume that he gets into the idea of having a good moral foundation, really a Christian foundation. I mean, Adam Smith was a Christian, and he believed that if you followed, particularly, followed biblical teachings and particularly followed natural law, that you would be a more successful capitalist, right? So in other words, if you are whatever, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you don't want to make drugs that are going to kill your customers, or if you're you know a, a restaurant, you don't want to make food that's going to make your customers sick, because then you're not going to have any customers after a while. So, but I am absolutely convinced that you're right, that if there are people out there that in a capitalist system where your passions are less constrained, you will go for some short-term gain. You get rich quick, even though you might go out of business in the long run. And so that's a huge danger. And then the notion of competition
Well,
between.
this is what I said. As I said in my, as I said in my introduction,
Yeah,
like I said, like the capitalist model really, it needs to be undergirded by like
sure,
Christian principles.
should be.
Otherwise, I
Yeah,
mean, because well, this is the problem. I mean, it's just the concept of liberty in general.
right.
Like you think when humans are free to just do whatever they want. Well, the problem is, as Lutherans teach in this idea of original sin and this concupiscence, that we're all not just born but conceived with this innate desire
Right.
to sin and to benefit myself. I like to say to people, original sin is just the desire to benefit and look after yourself. It's the me concept that I want this, I need this, forget everybody else. I don't care about anyone else as long as I get what I want.
Yep.
And that inbuilt, ingrained disease in humans does need to be constrained by something.
Yep.
And partly, Paul talks about in Romans 13 that is the purpose of the government, is to curb wickedness in society.
Yep.
So that's why we have given the government the authority of the sword to wield over us, so that it can restrain our sinful passions.
Right.
There's also, if everybody was Christian, there wouldn't be such a problem per se, as long as everybody was constrained by God's law.
Right.
But we don't live in a perfect society where everyone's a Christian. And even these days, we're not even living in a society where a majority of people are Christians anymore. And
Yeah.
whether you go communist or capitalist, that's gonna lead to a problem. And what I find most ironic is that in the countries that start off as capitalist without Christian values underneath, there seems to be this innate desire of the capitalists to become communists, because I think it grows from this idea of, okay, first I'm poor and everyone else is better than me, and so I need a system where I can rise above the rest. So capitalism's good for that, because it can take someone from poverty to billionaire quite easily. But then once I've hit billionaire, I'm like, no, I can't lose this, and I can't risk anyone else rising up to this level. So I need to chop everyone else down. And so now that I've risen above,
Right.
now it's time for me to become a communist so I can keep everyone else down.
Pull the ladder up. Yep. Yeah. I mean, human sin is so inventive, I guess I would say. I wouldn't even want to put that positive thing on it. But I definitely like what you brought up about Luther and the fourth and seventh commandment. I mean, the seventh commandment is so fascinating, and the fourth commandment too. But how Luther talks about, I think he terms it, well, into the English, it's sneak thieves. So like a cat burglar, right? That would come in and steal my TV at night. Luther says, yeah, he's breaking the seventh commandment, but he's not as bad as that mechanic down the road who cheats you. That guy's worse than the sneak thief, and the government's got to come in. And he talks about again, children who refuse to be constrained by their parents. Well, guess who's next in line? The hangman. And that's who you're going to face next. Yeah, and with capitalism, there is the opportunity to grab for that short-term gain that it seems completely selfish. But what's bizarre about, I mean, if you understand business at all, this is where I think Adam Smith was on to something here, and the founding fathers of really of America and the Western world, when the first words out of their mouth, we find these truths to be self-evident, that man was created by God, right, with these things. Okay, so that put the ultimate authority in God's hands, and without that belief that God, so I don't have a ton of use for Jordan Peterson, but he's interesting to listen to. But he says, well, I may not believe in God, but I better act like he exists, right? Okay, that I guess I can take. I'm not real. I think that's kind of a cop out. But I would take somebody who would pretend that God exists rather than somebody who doesn't. And that, because that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about somebody that will even destroy themselves in the pursuit of short-term gain. Because if you study business history at all, the businesses that have lasted many, many decades and years are the businesses who have foregone this short-term gain. So, hey, here's a real opportunity. I'm going to really stick it to this guy over here, and I'm going to make a bunch of money while I'm doing it. Well, those companies don't last. They end up going out of business a lot of times. But man's sin is so deep that you think, okay, I'm gonna do this and I'll be set for life, and then I won't have to worry about the future. Well, that often comes to bite you. And what Smith proposed was that capitalism.
Well, I was just gonna say that that's the whole the foolish man. I'm trying to think of the exact name of the parable, but the guy who goes, he builds the bigger barns, gets a big harvest, and there is like, yes, now I'm set for life. Let's eat, drink, and be merry. And then he dies.
Right.
And
yeah.
So yeah.
100%. Well,
and I mean that's a good idea. That's a good example of the Bible showing that what is the dangers of a godless capitalism,
sure.
of where you just pursue just money. Right. I mean that's just in Christianity in general. This whole concept of the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Sure.
That doesn't mean that money is wrong. I mean, you can look at someone like Abraham in the Old Testament, who was quite wealthy. God blessed him very well, and that's great. But it's when it really goes back to the first commandment of if you take out God and you replace God with money, well then that's a problem.
Yeah, well, and I think what natural law shows us is, and biblical law obviously is natural law, but it shows you that even in free market capitalism, the market doesn't really tolerate. I mean, in its, I don't know if in its pure sense, but in the long term, the market itself doesn't tolerate immorality. It might in the short term, but in the long term it doesn't. And people eventually get their comeuppance. But at the same time, like you're saying, you can't just let people kind of have a stab at it if they want. You've got to have some constraints on them. But it's so interesting because what happens is we're so inventive with sin, because the government will come in and they'll put these constraints on business and say, hey, you can't do these things because it's not fair to the consumer, not fair to this, you're polluting the environment or whatever else. Well, the companies, the really big companies in the United States at least, that really have all the market share and that sort of thing, that sort of thing really doesn't damage them too much. Who that usually ends up hurting are smaller businesses, so they call that regulatory capture. So the government will come in and sometimes on purpose, because there's political motives behind all this, right? Somebody will get elected to do something, and they'll put a regulation in place that it'll hurt the bigger businesses, but not enough to put them out of business. What it'll really do is put the little businesses out of business that are trying to compete with the bigger business. And so, yeah, they call that crony capitalism or regulatory capture. And so it's just amazing how many different ways we can invent to sin while we're doing all this. But again, it's kind of like, okay, so you look at human history, and maybe we could invent another way to constrain man's sin, but this is what we're stuck with, type of thing. We already know that communism, we don't want to go there. The biggest thing that worries me about, I'm not as worried about socialism or like wealth redistribution, although I think there's an immoral aspect to that as well. Where I would really start to get worried is when the redistributionism got to the point, or where some leader decided that they wanted to own all of the capital. That's what Stalin tried to do in Russia. He tried to collectivize, so the state owns all of the.
And yeah.
So that's where that stuff gets really scary. Sure.
Well, just on all that, because I was talking about like how earlier in my introduction about how there is in the Bible, there is some sense of principles of welfare and even state welfare. Yep. But even in those cases, they didn't take away individual property. Right. Like that is something that the Bible has ingrained since like beginning of Adam and Eve, and that there is this sense of individual property. I own this, I own that. And even when the government, like this like full Soviet style communism where the government, everything belongs to the government, nothing is individually owned. Right. That's a breaking of the seventh commandment, because that is just plain theft.
Yep.
Like taxes, the Bible, Jesus, Paul, even Luther in the Catechism, taxes is not theft. I mean, there is a sense that if you live in a country and there are communal public goods, you should provide for communal public goods. Although listening to some people, I don't know if you've ever listened to Candace Owens,
Sure.
was listening to her podcast just recently, and she was talking about kind of the ridiculousness of everything we get taxed for these days. She was talking about how the American Revolution was fought over like tea taxes and all these ridiculous taxes that the government just started to enforce for simply just so that they can have more money to fund whatever they wanted to fund.
Right.
See, and it made me think about this of going, okay, a lot of the original concepts of tax were you got taxed on things like, okay, well, you drive on the road, so we're going to have registration for cars. So you have to pay to drive a car on the road, and essentially that money then is going to go into a communal fund to pay for road repairs. We need to fund a military to protect the nation. Okay, so we're going to need some kind of tax to take from people to fund this communal good. So these things are not only good ideas, they're just logical sense that if there's a communal good, everybody should fund towards it. We see this in the church. You know, we have the collection every Sunday, the offering, and that money then goes into some bank account that's owned by the church to pay for church expenses.
Right.
And, you know, when there's a communal utility that everybody uses, there should be some kind of communal fund that everybody puts their money towards.
Right.
So this is just logical sense. What problem is when you start getting governments that then, you know, yep, like I said, welfare, there is a concept of biblical welfare, and that's good. When they just start welfaring for everything, and then they need that money, the government wants to spend money on this, that, and the other, so they need money from somewhere, so they'll just increase the tax. I was listening to a podcast in Australia here, and the guy explained that he'd gone through what we are all taxed in Australia, and he said, we actually, when you calculate everything we pay tax on electricity, we pay tax on fuel, we pay tax on, I don't know if you guys have it, we have a GST, a goods and service tax. So every time a business does a service or a product, 10% of that has to go direct to the government. So if I want to sell a fridge for $100, I sell it for $100, and 10 of those dollars go straight off to the government.
Yep. And
he went through and he said, when we actually calculate what we all pay tax on, the individual is paying over 50% of their wage on tax.
Yep.
I'm like, well, that is ridiculous. I shouldn't. No wonder. And then you go, oh, well, now we need all this government welfare. Yeah, but if the government didn't give out so much stuff and let me keep more of my money, I wouldn't need so much government welfare and stuff like that, because I'd have more of my own money that I get from work. Right. I don't know if you guys have it. We have a minimum wage in Australia.
Yep.
And that is a very problematic thing. I was working at a motel here in town, and they told me that they couldn't really afford to have me. They needed a worker, but they couldn't really afford to pay their worker. And there'd been talks with our last federal election of raising the minimum wage about $3 more. And my employer told me, he said, well, if that happens, I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go, because we're struggling to pay for you now, even though we need you. Yeah. But if we have to pay you an extra $3 an hour, well, then that's it. You're fired, because we'll just have to make do without you. And so if we could not have a minimum wage like you guys in America have, we'd actually have a lower unemployment, because, you know, places could pay less and hire more workers.
Yeah, that whole thing's ironic. Yeah, we have a minimum wage.
We also have Medicare. I mean, I know you guys kind of have something like that, but we just have a public system Medicare with the government. We do have private health insurance for people as well, but government pays for everything. So my taxpayer, if I had private health care, I'd be paying for my private health care, plus my taxpayer dollars are going to pay for somebody else's government funded health care. So again, if we scrapped a lot of these things, government wouldn't need to tax me as much.
Right. Well, that
and then I could have more money to spend.
Yeah, that all goes back to this concept of part of, and I don't think this is necessarily sinful, but part of it can be part of man's nature is that he wants to do things voluntarily. So you talk about theft. Okay, so it's, I mean, at its basic level, what is theft? It's, you know, it's when I take something of yours without your permission, right? And so when the government takes your money and spends it on something that they don't have your permission to spend it on directly, then that's a problem. See, that's, you know, again, that's where, you know, the man's sin is just we're just shot through with it. And even the governments that were built on this notion of representation, you know, the whole idea of no taxation without representation. Well, the fundamental principle that underlies that is theft. Okay, because if you're gonna take my money, then I want to have a say in why you're taking my money and what you're spending it on. Well, we're getting further and further away from that, and that's where, you know, taxation really essentially does become theft, because if the government's confiscating your money and spending it on things you don't agree with, or they don't have your permission to spend it on explicitly, then that's a problem. And that's why, you know, originally the idea was for the government to be very, very limited, because the people were going to have to give their consent to the government to do whatever it is they were going to do with the taxes. And so, yeah, that's why that's so infuriating, because taxes have just become this, you know, well, we're going to confiscate your money and spend it on whatever we want. Well, you don't have my permission to spend my money on whatever you want. you're supposed to be representing me.
I was good. I mean, a good example of spending stuff on things people don't want. I don't know if you guys have over in America. Do you guys have like a state-funded broadcaster?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So we have the ABC here in Australia, and one thing that is mostly it's the conservatives that complain about this is going, I don't want my taxpayer-funded dollars going to fund kids shows that are teaching 5-year-olds about drag queens, or funding some kind of news that only ever, you know, talks about how wonderful Joe Biden is, but how evil any Republican is, or going to fund, you know, just these different shows that are just basically socialist propaganda. You know, I want to stay in what my money's going towards. And that's why there's been plenty of people that have talked about making it more of a subscription base, where it's still like a state funded thing, but that you can opt out of it. And I actually like that idea, because then, you know, I can opt out, and if they start putting on, you know, more conservative shows and stuff, well, then I can opt back in to have my money go there. And I mean, there's lots of different things. I think the biggest problem is with like the welfare state is there's things that our governments are doing that aren't necessarily like sinful theft. They're just idiotic policies. And sometimes it does borderline on theft, because what they want, they don't give us back more control. They're always taking control. They're always taking more money. There's rarely ever like a tax cut and things like that. And sad thing is when you do get governments that do try to cut taxes and cut spending and all these things, is they end up not being the most popular government, because people like their free handouts.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they don't realize that nothing is free, and if you get something for free, then somebody else is spending somewhere. So
right. Well, yeah.
And often it is yourself, because generally what happens is it's your taxpayer money going in, and then the government handing you back. Yeah. Which, I mean, I do love this, because I'm on what's called job seeker in Australia, where I get money from the government because I haven't got a job. Okay. Now I've managed to get some casual work.
Sure.
And so, but I'm not working enough hours for the government to take me off the welfare system. So I do get a little bit of money, like a supplement from the government each fortnight as payment.
Okay.
Yet at the same time, because I am working, I'm also paying tax on all the hours that I do work. Right. So it's basically, I'm in a middle ground, because I'm paying tax to the government, but then the government's paying me welfare. So I'm actually, I'm getting back really what I've given to the government. I'm just getting back my own money.
Yeah, it's a strange arrangement with a lot of those situations. I definitely feel your pain there. Well, and then so, you know, you've got these dangers of communism from the top down, right? That's really kind of what we've seen in human history. What's interesting about these times is I think it's the same in Australia as it is in the United States, because a lot of what you're describing we're experiencing here as well, where you've almost got this communism from the bottom up in a sense. Not that you've got kind of somebody rising up to do whatever, but the idea that I mean, when you have abandoned faith, then what becomes your god? So for a lot of these folks, they think that the government is their savior, and that the government is the one that's supposed to take care of them. And so they elect people that that are going to do that for them. And they think they don't want to work. I don't want to have to go out and do whatever it takes to make a living. I want the government to provide for me, so I can have my freedom to do whatever else. In the communist worldview, true freedom is freedom from labor, to be able to just be leisurely, kind of like we were talking about a couple episodes ago, where we're talking about Epicureanism and and hedonism. The natural state is the sinful state's gonna slide toward that hedonism, where you think, well, I would just want to sit around and enjoy life's pleasures and not have to work. Well, what you don't realize is that God created you to work, and that's one thing that communism really grates against, as far as natural law and God's law goes, is it robs man of that fulfilling thing that we call work. Because if you understand work properly, and in a Christian sense, it's something that's essential to how we're created. God created us to work. I mean, before the fall, we were commanded to work. So when you strip that away from people,
Adam was to prune the garden,
yeah.
And then God created. We get this in Exodus, when God gives the commandments about the Sabbath day. He's like, 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh you shall rest, because that is the way God did it in creation. It's actually like that concept of working and then resting is part of God's natural law. That's the way he created Adam and Eve to be, that they would work Sunday to Friday, and then rest on the Saturday. It was kind of just, that was part of, it was part of creation. It's part of the natural law that we should work.
Yep.
And like I said, he got Paul later in his epistle saying that if he who does not work shall not eat. If you can work and you're not going to work, I think that is, and it's problems where communism does take Christian values and kind of warps them. This idea of each according to his need, each according to his ability. Well, there's somewhat of a Christian value of everyone who is able to work should get out and work. And for those like the elderly and the children and the injured and those, they can't work, so they are to be cared for by those who can work. That is like a Christian principle.
Right.
And
but
this is why, like I said earlier, I think Christianity, it kind of draws a bit from communism and capitalism into kind of a middle system, where we go, well, there are kind of principles, because I think both of them have really grown out of Christianity. I mean, Marx. What's interesting is, I think Marx's biggest problem is that they tried to really connect communism on atheist principles. But I've watched numerous videos on this, that the kind of socialist communist kind of ideology did kind of exist before Marx. It was growing out of this Christian concept of loving your neighbor, caring for your neighbor, that you have this sense of duty to the greater good, and stuff like that. So, it's communism is to some degree. I was listening to a Table Talk Radio episode recently, and Brian Wolfmuller was pointing out how he said wokeism is a Christian heresy. And he says that the idea of woke values kind of stems from the Christian values, but then takes them and runs into a heretical thing. And to some degree, you could also say communism is a Christian heresy. It kind of grows out of this love your neighbor, care for your neighbor, care for the greater good. It's not all about me kind of Christian values, and then it runs wild with them.
Yeah.
And I think even like we're talking about capitalism does, again, it's grown out of a Western Christian society, this idea of liberty, freedom, self-responsibility, all that stuff. But yeah, when you take God out of the picture, it just runs wild, and it can
Yeah, it
lead
can. Well,
lead
I
down
don't.
devastating paths.
That's an interesting thought experiment or discussion to have is which over human history, and it's maybe hard to tell because again the United States was so founded in at least deism, if not theism, and if not Christianity. I mean, when the country was founded, we were Christians, and being religious, especially being Christian, was encouraged. Okay, so maybe that's what's sustaining it. But so far in human history, what has proven to constrain man's passions the best without being overly oppressive, like being an authoritarian dictator of some sort, has is really Western liberalism and capitalism. Okay, but you might have a point that we're still just kind of living off the fumes of our Christian roots, whereas communism really didn't have that chance. They threw Christianity out and said, okay, we're going to do a whole other thing, which maybe is what the problem is. The thing where I think communism is corrupt, two reasons. One, I think it really does rob men's dignity because it robs them of work. I think that's one of the major problems with communism. So it's very oppressive in that sense. And then on top of that, it takes your stuff, takes all your stuff. It says you don't have any more stuff. The stuff all belongs to everybody. So there's a couple of real fundamental pieces of human dignity that strips from you, which I don't think that as a necessity you're going to find in a Western democracy. But I think you're right. At the end of the day, sinful man that just casts off God's law and has no care for even natural law. Eventually you're gonna corrupt that. Any system's gonna get completely corrupted. So, the notion.
I think you used an interesting concept when you talked about your family. You said a benevolent dictator.
Yeah.
It's always the thing, like, which is better, having like a monarchy or having like a republic democracy kind of thing? And you go, I think actually reality is either system you need Christianity, because if you have a good benevolent dictator, if you had like a good Christian monarch, you can have a great nation. Look at King David.
Yeah.
But then you can easily look at all the bad kings of ancient Israel and how that system fell apart.
Right.
Yet then when you get like a republic and a democracy and stuff, that now becomes like kind of majority rules, and if long as the majority's got Christian values and they're basing their policies on Christian values, that's a good system. But then if you get a democracy that is like largely anti-Christian, well then that becomes problematic. Pretty much any system, political, economic, becomes terrible once you take Christianity out of it.
Yeah, it's going to become corrupt. Especially if at the very least, I think the founders of the United States believed that, okay, at least we all can agree on natural law. That's what we're going to go with, and that's what we're going to run with. Okay, but that presumes a creator. So you've kind of got that going for you. However, I think it's an interesting discussion to have. And my opinion right now is, I'm not completely settled on this, but my opinion is that capitalism and Western liberalism, in the classic sense, have more by nature biblical principles guiding it, and therefore is a much more why they can be corrupted and everything else. It's a much more sustainable system than something like communism. Communism is always going to be corrupt. You're never going to. Because again, I think even just on that, like even free market capitalism is kind of, it's like the oldest system. I mean, I know people like have this idea that it's this new American system, but I mean, you think back to ancient Israel. Sure.
Everybody had their own farm. It wasn't like there wasn't even much kind of corporations, like a corporation run thing. It was pretty much every individual. I had my property. I had my farm animals.
Yep.
Government didn't take it. You even see this in the story of Naboth's vineyard. When Naboth has his vineyard, and then King Ahab's like, I want your vineyard. I want it. And Naboth's like, no, it's my vineyard. It's my family's vineyard. I will pass it on to my children. You can't have it. And then Ahab's all miserable because even though he was the king, he couldn't just go in and take it.
Right.
They had to do this whole big dodgy thing with Jezebel. They had to like frame Naboth and say he was a blasphemer and get him stoned to death. And then the king could just waltz in and take it once it was owned by nobody.
Yep.
But like, there was this sense that everybody owned their own property and the government couldn't just take it off you. It was my property. It was my animals.
Right.
Sure, there was a tax. But again, this is like, I said, tax was a communal thing. I mean, I don't know if there was much of a state tax so much in ancient Israel. There doesn't seem to be a mention of it. There is kind of, was it under, I think Josiah implemented a kind of temple tax, which was he put the big, like the community chest out there and everybody who came to the tax had to put money in. And that was then for everyone in Israel was to go towards funding the temple.
Right.
And so, yeah, like I said, if there's a communal good, there should be a communal bank account. Everybody should kind of put into that. But yeah, there was a sense that everybody retained their own things. And often, I mean, it wasn't so much of a tax in ancient Israel because often the kings kind of got their wealth from conquering other nations and stuff like that. So
the kings went out and fought with their armies. Well, so I would say if you're going to look at systems and what's more compatible with Christianity, I think communism is you're hard pressed to find really any principles that are compatible with Christianity. Now, a lot of people say, well, what about all the, like you mentioned, they all shared together and that sort of thing. What Holy Scripture teaches, the Old and New Testament, is that the taking care of the widow, the orphan, and that sort of thing, that was to be done on a voluntary, individual basis. If you see somebody that was in poverty around you, you would, that was really people complain that Holy Scripture.
There's also a sense of duty. I think that's something that's fallen out. Like our cultures, like, I don't know if America has probably the same thing. We don't live so much now in like an honor, duty-based kind of society where it's just like expected of you to do that because that's just the done thing. There's no, there's no government coercion. There's not even like a money incentive to do it. You just did it because that was just the done thing to do. You were raised to be a decent person that looked after your neighbor. I mean, just on that, there was somewhat of a kind of an enforced welfare kind of thing somewhat in the Old Testament, but that wasn't enforced by the government. Government never enforced it. It was God enforced. Part of the old civil Mosaic laws was when you harvest your fruit trees or you harvest your paddock, you go over it once and you don't go over it a second time, and and you don't harvest right to the corners or whatever. You leave those little bits of leftovers for the homeless and the widow and stuff to come. Which even that, I like that idea of, it's more of a welfare, but it's a working welfare. Like you see in the case of Ruth, you want that. You didn't just sit there at home and waited for the government to bring you a check. You actually had to go out, find a field, and you had to get out there on your hands and knees. And I mean, the idea was that the farmer has gone through and harvested, and any good farmer, he's not going to want to leave much behind.
Right.
So they were commanded by God to, not be super, thorough like these days, and go over it a second time. So what got left.
Right.
But the widows and that had to get out there on their hands and knees and basically go through the field, go, yes, there's a head of grain, and that's not a lot either. I mean, they had to work for their welfare.
Sure. Well, right, and the thing of it was that wasn't a cruelty from God for the farmers to leave that, and then people have to go out and work for it. Again, work is part of man's dignity, and if you're not working and you're just having things handed to you, I think eventually that is not good for you. It's not good for your soul. Whether you're a Christian or not, if all you're doing is sitting around waiting for a government check to show up and you're not working, then you're being stripped a part of your dignity, whether you realize it or not. And then you mentioned, God was Israel's king, and of course that when Israel got a king is because they demanded a king. God was was like, okay, you're going to get what you asked for. And so, if you think about governments throughout human history, I think the republic or the representative republic is about as close anymore that you can come to letting God be king. And I think that's what the founders had in mind. Again, of America, is that they they said, okay, we want a situation where we don't have a human king anymore because we know that's such a flawed system. We want a situation where God is king and we are just the stewards of whatever he's king of. So the idea was God gave these rights to humans, and the only role of government has is to protect those rights. That's it.
Well,
Beyond that, yeah.
I think what's interesting is like you talk about the king, because if you go back to what kind of politics in the period of the judges, now yes, God would raise up a judge every now and again, and the judges were more of a military leader more than anything. They weren't much of a king.
Right.
But generally, what was their system? Well, it was really bottom up kind of governance, where like there was the different tribes of Israel, and they basically worked like a confederacy of tribes, and generally it went bottom up. Like there would be your family, and so there's the father of the house, and then there'd be like your little patriarch of your clan,
Right.
and then the clans made up the tribe, and there'd generally be like some kind of general patriarch that oversaw like the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Ephraim. They'd have some kind of head representative, and then there wasn't really much of a role then of who was in charge. Often the tribes dealt with themselves. If there's some kind of dispute, like a religious dispute, you might go to the Levites and the priests and ask them to settle it. And then when there was like a military problem, God would raise up a judge, and he would take care of the military needs. But yeah, often it was pretty much, there was quite a lot of freedom, and everybody like, okay, well, your tribe's over there, and
Right.
Dad's responsible for his family, the clan leader's responsible for his clan, and the tribal leader's responsible for the tribe, and that's who you answer to.
That's I really like that, because I think I could point it. So you've got communism stripping men of the dignity of work, the dignity of their private property, but also communism
Individuality.
strips, what's that? Yeah,
Individuality, just in general.
yeah. Well, but you were hitting on it right there. Communism really strips men of the family union, because once you
Government's your family.
yeah, because now who's the big brother, right? Who's mother? It's Mother Russia, right? The family is really stripped away from the man, and now you don't have men. I mean, look, that's the thing that's a big concern in the United States. It might be in Australia too, but you've got folks who are receiving government benefits, and to such a degree that they feel like they don't need men to be husbands to them or fathers to their children. So we've got a insane illegitimacy rate in the United States. So yeah, a bunch of boys, particularly, that's one of our big problems. A bunch of boys being raised without fathers. So you don't have a family unit to instill values into these children, and then when they go out into the world, they just don't know what to do with themselves. So all this dependence on government, yeah. So it's
this is where I think it always goes from the bottom up versus top down. Communism really works on top down.
Yep.
Of it starts with the government's in charge. Government is family. Government is everything.
Right.
Whereas when you really look at Christianity, and like I said, you see this in Luther's Catechism, government stems from family, but not. The government doesn't replace family. It stems from the family. It starts at the family unit, then goes to the wider clan, then goes to the wider tribe, then to the nation, and it goes bottom up. It starts with, and often another thing that often gets lost with a lot of communism and even just general kind of just non-Christian governments, not saying anti-Christian, is this sense of like I mentioned it before, sense of duty and responsibility that, like, to quote, Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility. And that's really this Christian principle of, if you're going to be in this role, we're giving you this authority because that authority comes with responsibility. If you're going to be in that position, it's not so you can do what you want. It's actually for the sake of looking after us. And I think also, as Lutherans, this stems even from in the church, we have this idea of the office of the keys. And in Lutheranism, we teach that the keys belong to the congregation, who then authorize the ministers to distribute those keys.
Right.
And so you as the pastor, sure, you're the leader, you're the one preaching, you're the one giving the sacraments, but that then comes with a bunch of responsibilities to do that. Doesn't mean you get to be dictator and king. It means that you're the one who's authorized to act on our behalf. And that, I think that's great that it gets forgotten a lot of the times, but our government, they are public servants. They are there to serve the people. And there's a minor party here in Australia known as One Nation, and I was listening to a podcast, an interview, one of their members, Malcolm Roberts. Whenever he gets up in Parliament, he introduces himself as Malcolm Roberts, a servant of the people of Australia, and whatever his little introduction is. But he does that, and he's like the only politician that does that, and it's because they are kind of one of those parties that makes the point of, we're here for the people. That is our job. We're not just here to take power and money and do what we want with it. We're actually here to serve. Right. And we've been going for over an hour. I've got some more interviews to do today, so we should probably wrap this up. So I'll let you, your YouTube channel, do you want to wrap up with the final thoughts on all this topic?
Well, appreciate this conversation. This is a topic that absolutely fascinates me. And thanks for having me on about it and letting me broadcast a little early on my YouTube. I know my listeners will love this. But right. Yeah, it's, the one thing I would say is I think we've got more hope for people to, for sin to be constrained. I think we've got more hope in a Western capitalist system than we do in a communist system, for sure. As I articulated earlier, there's just so many things that communism strips from a man that just can't be sustained. And you're right. The people that are supposed to be public servants they just end up it's a big power grab. Somebody might say, oh well, yeah, Stalin might have said, oh yeah, I want to serve the people, but you have to give me all your money and all your capital. So I can properly serve the people, and I'll decide how best to serve the people, and that just ends up being a gigantic power grab. So I am probably maybe even hawkish to a fault on when I see, communism trying to reach its tentacles into society in all kinds of different ways, and really, as you mentioned, the woke thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say what I find interesting, and I always like terminology and how terms matter.
Yeah.
The term authoritarian is a very interesting term, because these days the term authoritarian is pretty much now synonymous with totalitarian, and that really grows out of kind of the whole history in the 1900s. If you actually look up like Webster's dictionary and that, and you look up the etymology of authoritarian, and the original dictionary definition of authoritarianism from the mid 1800s is, the original view of authoritarian was this idea that it just meant government had the authority to create law and order in society, which is a Christian principle. It's common sense. The government should be there so that there's law and order. That was the original definition of authoritarianism, which I like to sometimes refer to as classic authoritarianism. These days, authoritarianism has pretty much drifted into just, it's synonymous with totalitarian. It's just grab. And I think what's interesting with that is that not only has the term shifted, I think the term has shifted because government itself has shifted in that same model where, government was originally implemented there. Your job is to create law and order, to keep peace, to so people don't just go around killing each other, so that there's some kind of order in society. And yet they've continually progressed to take more and more authority on themselves, more and more power. And so, well, I do find that interesting that not only has the term authoritarian shifted in its meaning, but actually the government itself has shifted along with that word. In that it has become more totalitarian in its kind of control.
100%. Well, and pendulum swing and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, I think throughout history, what you see is things are going to get worse before they get better, and that's when stuff it's kind of like I can't remember where it is. I think in Second Kings, can't remember the exact account. But when Josiah rediscovers the scriptures, isn't it Josiah, King Josiah, who rediscovers? Oh, look
Yeah.
at these scriptures that we've been ignoring all this time, and stuff had gotten so bad, and like no wonder stuff is horrible because we're completely ignoring God's word. Well, I'm not to say that I think that something like that will occur. Stuff will get so bad we'll go, gosh, what do we do now? Oh, you remember what, I don't know, should the Lord tarry, 1,000 years from now, people 1,000 years ago, what did those people do like, a couple thousand, 1,500 years ago? Didn't they follow some God? Or let's look, it's hard to say. But that's the sad story of human history, is that stuff gets so bad that people go, okay, this is not working and we've got to do something else. And they, if you want anything to get better, you've got to revert back to God's law, at least the natural law. And that means, people returning to Christ, and we just pray for God's mercy that sort of thing happens. But
Well, it is true. Once the government takes too much authority, people do snap back. I mean, you had the Magna Carta got signed in England when the government got too authoritarian there, and then even though they had the Magna Carta, they were technically a constitutional monarchy. The British government started cracking down its colonies, and so you guys, America, kicked up a fuss about that as well. And eventually people, communism got so bad that eventually the USSR fell apart. I think it has a breaking point.
Yeah,
people snap at some point.
Yeah, and it is important to remember that at the end of the day, God is going to be the one to establish His kingdom, right? We are not going to be the ones to establish, the eternity going forward. We're not going to bring Jerusalem down out of the sky, and all we can do is live like we're already living in eternity, because we are. And that's where our struggles, I think, come with. When we see our government, struggling with issues like we're talking about, when we see people trying to do things like create communist utopias and that sort of thing, we see that human struggle, that desire for the kingdom of heaven to come. And what we have to remember is that the Lord is the one that's going to bring that. And anytime we see somebody trying to bring heaven on earth, beware. That should be a huge red flag to us, because anytime somebody's tried to bring heaven on earth, it's been hell. So.
All right, so let's wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt, for your time, and
Sure.
I hope the listeners have listened like this podcast, and I hope your viewers enjoy watching it on your channel too.
100%. I'm sure they will. Yeah, they love this stuff. So I appreciate you having me on, my friend.
Goodbye and God bless.
Thank you.